Great. Well, would you like to give us an introduction to your exhibition? Specifically, let's take a closer look at the title, Miscellany, and some other stuff. Tell us a bit about how you relate that to your practice and interests.
Sure. In all honesty, the title I think came about somewhat haphazardly. I was still, struggling to figure out how some of this work was going to fit together. And looking at it now, it's kind of humorous. I think stuff is probably the most important word here. Uh, Also being the last word. Um, it's the important word for me is stuff because of the stuff. It's our material culture. It's the bric-a-brac, the junk, the commodities that we choose to live with, and that make up our sort of everyday life that I find really interesting, and specifically our relationship to them, right? Um, so yeah, I think we could. Oh yeah, so the this piece, the most valuable legs for the most valuable horses, um, is an interesting one in the show that I think maybe is directed right at this. It's two images. One's a photograph and one's a drawing. But the photograph is of a collection of porcelain horse legs that have been placed in a pelican case. Kaylee, if you want to go to the next slide, maybe. Yeah. Um, Thinking about the porcelain horse as a commodity, as a like tchotchke, um, it it's precious, it's delicate, it's cute, it's articulate, it's got these things going for it, and we can look to the history of porcelain as a material um, to sort of support some of those conventions or assumptions or whatever. Um, but the porcelain horse, like the real horse, is really only valuable if it has all its legs. Um, so there's something interesting about the legs then become the sort of they're the utility, but also the sort of real use value or currency of of the thing. So I think there's something interesting about. I've taken an approach of like uh, the horse is objectified or commodified through the porcelain, sculpture, statue, figurine of it, and by breaking off its legs, I've sort of zoomed in even closer in that kind of commodification of the thing, right? It's been reduced. I'm attempting to like reduce or distill it down to its most like potent form, right? Uh, and then placed in this case that's obviously for protection, not display, right? Um, and there's within all of the sort of found objects, things of mass-produced objects that I work with, they all have an inherent value system, right? They have beliefs that are associated with them, and that's due to their means of production, their materials, cultural context, historical context. There's a lot of things that influence that. Um, but what I really like about them is that they imply us, they implicate us. They speak to our society's beliefs, both as at the production level, so large quantities, but also at the individual level because of what we choose to consume, right? What we choose to partake in. And, in a sort of Marxist critique, obviously, I'm concerned or interested in the way that that those things then become the sort of building blocks for how we come to understand our perception of self, right, or identity, or how we fit within the world, right? It's in relationship to how we produce and how we consume. And there's something interesting about being being a maker, but even being an object maker, being a sculptor, where these things sort of, they do and don't have utility at times. So like, what does it mean for me to ride that line of producer and consumer? I don't know. It's so yeah. There's I think the found object and the assemblage of those things has become a sort of pillar of my practice in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think I relate, or I'm most intrigued by this like numbering system on the bottoms of the legs. It really throws it into this like, um, I don't know, a contact sheet or something that you would find at an auction. But
Yeah,
this was once a history, like this was a toy to be played with, or a figurine, or a symbol of some sort.
sure. When I made the thing and then determined that a photograph of it was the appropriate format or sort of vehicle to communicate that information. But it felt like it still needed some, some other type of didactic or something. It needed some other sort of framework for how to understand it. And, you know, in this sort of format, it's like the foil underneath the lid of a box of chocolates, right? It's got these like line drawings that sort of register the objects within the frame, and they're numbered. Those numbers don't actually really point to anything. And the horse legs themselves in the photograph also are coded in a sort of nonsensical way. Okay, if you could, I think, advance like 2 slides, maybe. Yeah. So here's sort of a close up in the studio. So I've employed this strategy in a number of pieces where there's a like label or numbering system, but they're in like non-sequential order. So it implies that there are other components maybe of the collection out in other places or spaces, or that this is a sampling of a few different collections. It sort of feathers the boundary of the work, right? Like how it actually exists out in real space and where the edge of it is. Yeah, I think in an interesting way.
Yeah. To think about like the uniqueness of an item and something that could be yours or that is someone else's, but you're consuming it in this way of like, I don't know, this is presented like a box of chocolates. Like this is all for you, but then to be entered into this larger system. Could you talk a little bit about like toys and play? In your work, you use pool noodles and specifically in the show, rocket ships and baseballs. Could you talk about using toys specifically as a raw material?
Sure. I think toys exist in a number of ways and have been, have historically in, in some different contexts. But I think toys are inherently sort of pedagogical, right? They're about teaching in a way. And I think that they're either teaching in the best light and propaganda in the worst, right? And sometimes those two things could be the same thing, I suppose, or somewhere in between. But they have an agenda, right? They're promoting a lens or a worldview or an approach, and I think kids are really good at imagining themselves in these other places and spaces and roles. Um, so I think toys just as a genre of object, let's say, I think they have a lot of potential. They hold a lot of capacity or reserve, right, to do a lot. So sort of that, aside, I think play is also something that's really important um, in my practice, my like making practice. Um, And I think it's important to distinguish, just sort of as an aside, I think it's important to distinguish the difference between like play and experimentation. And one, experimentation, generally speaking, you're looking for an outcome, right? You have a hypothesis, maybe it's not quite that formal, but and you're attempting to, to prove something usually. I think play, although play implies a certain set of rules, or specifically the development of rules, right? How you build criteria and standards and values for any given task or a project, or a way of looking, right? Um, I think that's really important. So I think, back to toys, I think using toys as material, uh, they like everything else that's, that's mass produced or a found object in this way, they come preloaded, right? They've got a history, and um, maybe maybe it's been appropriated, maybe not, maybe it's already been converted from one form into another. And I think doing that, working with material like that that's loaded in that way presents it presents some challenges and affords some really interesting things. You It sort of comes with a little bit of a framework. Uh, but you also have to work within that and maybe play a little bit of detective, right? Like if you decide that you want to use yellow rubber ducky as a potential material, right? First of all, you better know some things about the yellow rubber ducky. You better know uh, when it was invented, who produced it, how it was produced. You should probably know that there's a yellow rubber ducky museum. You should probably, you know what I mean? Like the thing, it sort of builds out. And I think it's once you start to play that sort of cultural anthropologist and dig into the how and why these things were produced, their intentions, you begin to understand that they've already had a cultural identity to them, right? They've already had a certain cultural, produced a certain cultural resonance. And so then the question becomes, what is the nature of my intervention on this thing, right? Like how am I going to use this as a vehicle to communicate something else? And I like to think about like shifting a thing's like trajectory, and that could be a trajectory in like physical space and place and time. It could be like a cultural or a contextual trajectory. Things that are mass produced are sort of made with a lifespan, right? We have an idea, these aren't going to become heirlooms, right? We have an idea of like how long they're going to exist. The plastic's going to start to break down. It's going to get left out in the sun and dry out. It goes to a garage sale. It then eventually ends up in the landfill. And there's sort of a estimated window when people design and produce these things. And I'm really interested in the ability to sort of knock them out of their trajectory, right? And to sort of push that that metaphor a little farther, you think about like in the vacuum of space, if I wanted to knock something off its trajectory, there's only like a certain amount of force that I can apply on it, and I will also get sort of pushed back in the opposite direction. And I think that that's a good sort of very romantic metaphor for the negotiation that happens when you're working with material that comes like this, right?
Yeah, speaking of like intended use and lifespan and obsolescence, how do and who decides when that trajectory is set off course? How does the concept of power or authority function in your work?
Sure. Yeah, I think about I think about obviously in the last year, I think hopefully everyone has been thinking about power and authority, but it's something I've always been interested in, and I think in the last few years, maybe the last 5 years, I've been thinking about uh, authority as it relates to like the classroom, right? And specifically the teaching tools, I'll call them, like physical things sometimes, or like the infrastructure, and how from the classroom, and how that relates to uh, means of conveyance, I guess. So this piece, H is for hierarchy, is essentially a drawing of the sort of framework that you create when you teach someone how to draw letters. Okay, it's a colored pencil drawing on a white sheet of paper with two red lines that run parallel, uh, and a dotted blue line in the center. Again, it's the framework, it's the structure, it's the system that you operate within. And that's the sort of conventional drawing. Everything else that's, the content that this is comprised of is sort of built on top of the framing structure, the physical framing structure. So there's, I think about it as like a children's flashcard. So there's the capital letter H and the lowercase letter h, and then we need some type of image that with a word that starts with the letter H. And so I was playing around with building this alphabet of these flashcards, but they would be concepts, right? Not tangible things. So not A is for apple, A is for apathy, or something to that effect, right? So hierarchy is essentially the podium that it's sort of athlete style podium, first, second, and third place. Um, and then there's essentially a stack of plexiglass between the drawing and the top edge of the frame, and on each layer, that H and that the image for hierarchy has been repeated. So through pattern and repetition, we're speaking about the structure itself, right? I think something that I really like about this piece is that it starts to imply, because of the layers of mat board, and it gets a sort of forced, like, first point perspective sort of thing happening because of the depth of the frame. Uh, it begins to sort of it implies the wall of the gallery in a way that I find really exciting. And that, again, it's sort of where like the edge of the work starts to dissolve a little bit, or become uh, more liminal or less material in an interesting way.
Yeah, it's got this telescoping effect too, that like even if you were passing, I can't even imagine a whole alphabet of these, you zoom in and you zoom out and you're back.
But so I've oh yeah, here we go. So I think going on this with schools specifically, and power maybe. This was a piece that I showed a few years ago at Survival Kit, a show curated by Anna Tararoba, and this was a column that I built in the center of the room, that I had basically wrapped a chalkboard from like the front of the classroom wrapped around it, right? Um, and like punishment, detention or whatever after school, having to write sentences. What's written around the chalkboard is the chalkboard is not a toy, and it's written a bunch of times or whatever. And so it immediately implies, sort of punishment within the classroom, right? That's the sort of explicit read. But I think tying into, architecture as a human-made but sort of designed oppressive structure that we, build and then have to sort of figure out how to live and work around. Um, and even just like it has a sort of monolith quality to it, right? We're immediately thinking about authority there. But something that was really interesting about, or I think the most unattended authority that happened in the room, because of the way that it was positioned in relationship to the door and where I had started the text to be written. In order to read it, you had to sort of walk around it in a certain way. And so it became this sort of conduit for controlling the way that people move through space. And so as much as, you want to look and think at a thing that's going to tell you about how oppressive it is, you bend to its will in order to see that. There's something sort of silly about that.
Yeah, that's a point
And
that I'm noticing in this work. We talk about play, and in some of your works, it's more of a play as in I'm celebrating that I am playing with this toy. But in this, and then some of the works in the show, it's more of a play brought on by, oh, I'm stuck with this thing. Like this chalkboard, you're stuck with your writing. Do you think about that, like a celebratory versus like this punishment authoritarian aspect of play?
yeah, I think, sure. Yeah, I think there's, I think the quilt in the show definitely is a little more celebratory. I don't know where we are in the slideshow
Yeah, we'll
here.
show
Yeah.
this one first because it's really early.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. So just again, to tie into, ideas of, the power structure, authority, and, this is sort of an interesting one. This I think works differently in the realm of found object than some of my other stuff. Most of my things, I operate as collections or assemblages. Um, but recently, I think this is operates more of like a composite, and I think part of the reason that it does that is because, these are pieces of porcelain from like blue willow plates or sort of cheap knockoffs of the 19th century productions. But by breaking these things up, destroying them in this way, breaking them down to these tiny little units, they don't speak about like plate anymore as material. I think they speak more about like porcelain, right? It's more about like ceramic or something, which is a little bit unusual, or at least not something I've done a lot in the past. Again, we're sort of zooming in closer, I think, maybe that's what's happening.
Go ahead and
Yeah, here.
show
So
this.
so this is a pairing of quilts called Under Penalty of Law, and the one on the right is a moving blanket. It's a ready-made. It's actually the only ready-made in the show, and by ready-made I mean an object that I have not altered in any way. And next to it is a quilt that's been made out of mattress tags. So like that thing on your couch, or your, the seat on your dining room chair, or your pillow that says, under penalty of law, do not remove this tag except by consumer, or something like that, something to that effect. So this is a quilt that's been hand stitched out of, I'm estimating like maybe 300 to 400 of these tags. And I think you were celebration, right? We were talking about the celebration of play and the structure. I think this, there's a lot of stigma around these tags, right? Hopefully, or I think most people, at least as a kid from the 90s, I grew up thinking that, if you rip these things off, the like cops were going to show up or something, or there was some type of regulatory body that was coming to check, your mattresses better have other tags when they come around or whatever. And there's something interesting about like the tag is there to protect the consumer, right? That's what it's there for. You're supposed to rip it off so this thing doesn't get sold again as a new product, right? So you're not only protecting yourself, but you're protecting other consumers potentially. But there's something interesting about like being a kid and not understanding that language, right? Like I didn't know what consumer meant, or that I was one, or that when I was playing with my action figures, like my relationship to them was like through their consumption was distorting my sense of self. You know what I mean? Like you don't know these things. And so there's a weird disconnect that happens there. Regarding the tags just in general as this sort of popular culture sort of thing, I guess, right? But I think this collection of tags, like it can't be one consumer, right? That doesn't make any sense. If we put our like anthropology hat on, that's ridiculous. It's got to be, a community of people or a family of people or, something. And something that I've always been attracted to quilts, and I've made a few of them. And I think the thing that's really powerful about quilts is that there's always a sort of direct one-to-one relationship between, well, first of all, they're utilitarian. I think that's important to say, right? They serve a function. And I think then aesthetically, there's a relationship to the aesthetics of it and a sort of belief system, an ideology, a way of thinking, a lens, a framework. And quite typically they're made from remnants, right? Small little bits of material that aren't big enough to do anything else with. And so, that aspect of utility and thinking about the mattress tag being like the discarded thing, right? The thing that you throw away. Then bringing this together as a collection or a unified object, it seems like I think there's definitely like a celebration of consumerism in a way, right? Or like a taking back of that a little bit. Yeah, I'm not sure how Zizek would feel about that, but maybe. And the moving blanket, I think, those are interesting. Technically, a moving blanket is a quilt, right? The way that it's produced, at least the one that's there. And I think that, at least it is quilted, right? And so they have these red frame around them. I'm thinking about Barbara Kruger. I shop therefore I am, right? And there's an interesting duality here, right? The thing that's made an assemblage of these mass-produced things that are intended to be discarded, and the quilt that was made by a machine to wrap your furniture in when you move it. It's kind of silly. Thinking about means of production specifically and how that relates to, a potential read of cultural, cultural value. The thing made by the machine, is simply that the thing made by hand uh, is embedded with this love and care and power, supposedly. Um, and that I see as a sort of duality. I like those two pieces operating together and vibrating in that sort of way. Um, this piece, although I think is informed by that other work and maybe aware of its presence in the room, if I could say that. Um, this is a digital weaving that I basically farmed out. Right, I sent an image to a website and received this in the mail. Um, which, thinking about means of production contemporarily, and even like DIY and the makers movement, this fits in, this sort of nestles in with those other two things in a sort of interesting way, or a perplexing way, maybe. I shouldn't say interesting. A perplexing way. And the image here, so there's a regulatory, there is, in fact, they're not police officers and they don't carry guns, but there is a regulatory agency that monitors companies putting these tags and the appropriate tag on the appropriate object. And I was able, similar to like downloading an OSHA manual for reading SDS sheets, you can download the manual for how to read these tags. Now, it's written for the companies that are making these things, so there's a little bit of jargon, but so this image is taken, it's an illustration taken from that manual that essentially shows us what information needs to be put on these tags, down to the font type and size and its relationship to the other components. So I think, thinking about means of production, this relates to these other two objects. It creates maybe a more holistic picture of like what people have been doing for the last little bit here. Um, and I think they sort of butt against one another, um,
When you zoom in like that, it's kind of ridiculous that there is all of this framework about something as simple as a tag. So, and you do this in your work, not only um, in the way that you assemble objects or put two together or play with them as they are installed in a room together. Could you talk about absurdity and even absurdity to the point of humor in your work? How you use as a tool. What does that do for you? What does that do for the work?
yeah. Yeah, I think there's a level of humor to most of the things that I do, and I think humor in general, I think, has the ability to, humor works in a lot of different ways. It has the ability to disarm people. I think it has the ability to express or implicate sort of shared experiences, right? If you laugh at something, it's because, at least to some extent, you believe that you understand, right? You believe you understand the sort of syntax of the sentence or whatever, right? So I also think that when you laugh at something, or when you get someone to laugh at something, they also then become like culpable in that situation, right? Like there's a sense of, or implication of maybe not approval, but like, you laugh, right? Like you also laughed, so like, and I think that when presenting work that is maybe difficult or brings up, whatever. I think that as a tool becomes an opportunity uh, to turn things on their head a little bit. And I think that in a lot of ways, materially, this. Oh, go back to Uncle Slam. Yeah, we'll talk about. So, I think in a lot of ways too, as far as like actual strategies that I employ, um, shifting material is another way that like humor gets used very directly. So the so this piece, um, Uncle Slam. It's called Uncle Slam. We haven't talked about titles yet. That's another thing we should probably touch on at some point. But so it's essentially these two plastic sets of horns, deer antlers, that are used for rattling. It's a product by a company called Primos. Supposedly the particular plastic composite nature of this material vibrates at exactly the same frequency as deer antlers. I don't know how we would test that, but um, so it's those, a tool, right, for hunting, and these pool noodles, strike pool noodles that stick out from the top. And it's America, it's Uncle Sam, I want you. But it's also like cornfield rave. And the antlers bring this sort of traditional macho stag uh aspect to it, but turned upside down, they become these silly bird feet, and they're sort of demasculating in that way. Um, and you think about a bald eagle or something. Uh, Pool noodles inherently, I think, are celebratory, right? That's a toy that's like pool time, like woo, you know. Um,
I like clapping them together. It's, the favorite.
Sure. But when the way that these things have come together, it creates it implies a figure, which I don't usually work figuratively. This is definitely, I think, definitely the most figurative work in the show. Maybe some other things imply figure, um, but it becomes this sort of looming, weird, fragile, you're about to knock it over sort of drunken bird thing that makes you think about America. Like it's like it's and I think that use of humor or the juxtaposition or positioning of materials in a way that uh like changes the way that you've thought about them in the past, or changes the way that you might approach them in the future. I think um that's when humor is working uh most successfully, I think, if that makes sense.
So do you want to talk about this
Yeah,
one? Makes me think a little bit about comics, just because this crack mark is so goofy in the way it hangs away from the wall. To talk a little bit about what's funny about this.
sure. So one of the other things I do, I'm a huge fan of Rube Goldberg. I think Goldberg is probably, if I had to pick like an artist that I'm most influenced by, I think it might be him. And for what it's worth. And so I love the like over designed object, the over complicated device. And I love what that says about humanity. I love what that says about and I love how it says it. I love how it says it through like it's like parody or sarcasm, or presenting a sort of alternative reality. I love Dr. Seuss for, the same reasons. Sneetches on the Beaches is a beautiful, beautiful allegory to consumer culture, right? So I like making these like gadgets and tools and things that supposedly do stuff as well. And there's so this is one of them, and it's a telescoping arrow. So it's a series of tubes of polystyrene, which is a really, really thin material, lightweight, and it's an arrow that will collapse on itself and then telescope back out. And so far, the ways that I've shown it is in this configuration. This is in the show towards the back wall, and it's positioned in a way that it looks like it was shot into the wall or whatever, and it has the way that it sort of hangs off the wall. It has this limp, sort of flaccid, sort of I don't know. It's humorous. The way that its material conditions are silly, right? And I think maybe similar to the way that the pool noodles of Uncle Slam's legs are like kind of a weird sort of cowboy bowed legs sort of thing. It has a similar effect there. So I think the ridiculousness of like the device is interesting here, or is where the humor is sort of pushing us. Um,
I want to look at Slam's legs again. Yeah.
Yeah, they've got a silly sort of.
I guess another thing, we're talking about presentation, and you've got the arrow that's in the wall, and none of the works in the show are on pedestals, and there's even, you can't see it in this photo, but we've got something hanging out on the grate there. We've got works displayed in buckets, and we've got gloves on the floor. Can you talk a little bit about like how you navigate, maybe this is the way you navigate your studio, about how do we navigate the gallery space?
Sure. I mean, this was, in a lot of ways, a sort of logistical thing. Typically, yeah, a lot of these things that are engaging the floor in this way, you'd probably have on a pedestal or something, or, have, taped off, masked off on the floor or something, or, the little rope things that are put up or whatever. And thinking about, the role of those again in a really like pragmatic way, that's to make sure that in an opening of a bunch of drunk people, nobody falls into the work or whatever, right? And I realized, thinking about COVID and what the opening like might or might not have been, and thinking about how people were going to engage the work in space, I realized that I had an opportunity to think about putting work in a room that I knew was only ever going to have, X amount of people in it at a time. And that I wanted to use that as an opportunity. I think, or exploit that in some way, right? I didn't want that to be just for granted. So I think the grouping of objects that I picked that actually engage the world, or excuse me, engage the floor in this way, I think they become a little unassuming. Of course, they're a little more approachable. I've seen people, physically engaging with them in ways that I think you normally wouldn't do with sculptural work, which is its own thing. I think something that I'm really struggling with, or something that I would like to do, maybe the next move here, is that I love the way that the works are speaking to, you know, the stuff that let me put it this way. Um, I'm not interested in reframing these objects or these types of objects as somehow precious or elevated or more valuable or important because of their confines within this space, right? And I don't necessarily think in a lot of instances, I don't think I'm asking you to radically change your approach or opinion of them. Um, what I am interested in is as these goods being the stuff that takes up the space in our lives, I'm interested in sort of liberating them like from the white cube. I don't know. I don't think they necessarily belong in this space. And that's, you know, that's personifying them with quite a bit of agency, uh, which is something that I talk about from time to time, but any good Marxist would cringe. Um, I I'm considering what happens when I take these things and liberate them back into the world and just walk away from them, and what how that changes their potential or capacity. You know, when you walk in a gallery space, to a certain extent, the expectation is that you're going to look at something uh, pretty or contemplative or challenging or um, you know, we could list a long, there's a long list of adjectives, right, verbs that we could put with that. I think when we find something out in the, you know, the like real world, right, that is you know, unique or astonishing or phenomenal or interesting or complicated or out of context or again, the, you know, list of words. I think there might be an opportunity for something a little more serious to happen, or at least I like the, you know, one of the reasons that I like making objects or working with objects outside of image making in any, you know, discipline, um, is that there's something about the object that like we will inherently have to deal with this thing in a certain way, right? The same way that we make all this clutter and this stuff, these that's sort of, you know, cluttering our personal lives, but also the planet and our cultural lives, like in all these ways, uh, we're making this stuff and we're going to have to live with it. And I'm interested in what happens with these types of things when they have to get lived with in that way, right? I think they're potentially more subversive. I think they're potentially more transgressive. Um, I think about being a child and finding something like this. So this is this is the Loch Ness duck. It's a foam and urethane resin model that's sort of a mashup of a duck decoy, sort of traditional wood carved mallard duck decoy, and what we think is one of the is a design for a maquette that was used to fake one of the earliest photographs of the Loch Ness monster. So if this photograph was fake, this is the type of thing they would have had to have built in like miniature to capture the photograph, right? So you know, so this does a few different things, but you know, I've tried to come up with a way to show this, to display it, whatever. And you know, every option seems to be it's alienated from its natural environment in a way that seems safe for me. Like it seems easy or safe or unrisky for me to see what happens out a more, I don't want to say natural because what is nature, but in a more contemporary environment. Uh, so then it gets, it gets tricky then thinking about, again, going back to this, struggling with my role as like maker and producer, but also consumer. Uh, you know, then what do I do with it? I charter a boat and I go out in the middle of Lake Erie and I just let it go or whatever. Okay. And so then do I photograph it? Of course. Do I film it? Sure. Do I put a GPS tracker in it? Do I put some type of message in it? Do I start an Instagram account for it? Do I ask people to find it and promote it and then send it off again or whatever? And I think the reality to all of those answers is that that's a way for me to continue to have a relationship with the thing as an art commodity, right? Because I want that stuff so that I can still maybe frame some photographs or show a show a video or something somewhere. Um, so this idea of like taking some of these things and sort of releasing them back, right? I scavenge them from the material world or material culture, and I've augmented them in some way. I've had some type of intervention on them, and then I sort of deliver them back out. I think maybe that's the next step for some of these things.
Do you want to take a chance to review some of the titles? You said you wanted to bring that up, or do you want to talk
Sure.
about the improvised events?
How much time we got? Where are we at here?
We don't really have an end time. I just want to make sure there's still some attention and some gusto to answer questions at the end.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think titles, just in general, speaking about titles, I think the titles become really important for the work. I don't necessarily, obviously I'm worried about or suspicious of any amount of like writing or language that needs to be present for the work to be understood or read. You worry about that text becoming a crutch. Thinking about the traditional museum didactic or whatever. But I think titles are still, sort of an inherent part of the work that is a beautiful opportunity to maybe hone in or open up that sort of framework for how, or that lens for how we're supposed to approach the work. Sorry, I'm trying to dodge the sunlight here. So, I think in most instances, right, I'll reveal the trade secrets here. So in most instances, I've got an object or an image or an idea of a thing that's going to do a thing, and there's some sort of material shift that's happening, right? So like this instance, I'm taking a regular arrow shaft and I'm shifting it into something that telescopes in and out in a stupid way, right? So there's that simple shift. And then, if we actually, will we go back to the wetsuit way back at the top? Yeah. So this is a great use of title. So So what I've done is I've created a wetsuit out of can koozies, right? So they're neoprene can koozies. It's the same material as a wetsuit. Um, but through the shift, this patchwork um, of can koozies, I've created this child-sized wetsuit. I think it's like 38 inches long or something like that. And going back to sort of material culture, commodity culture, the level of branding that's on this, I find really humorous. It reminds me of uh, my studded leather jacket from when I was a crusty punk kid in high school. Uh, it also reminds me of a NASCAR suit, right? It's branding. Um, and thinking about that branding as a means of constructing the self. But then, so there's the sort of the material shift from neoprene can koozie to neoprene wetsuit and the sort of stitching involved. Um, and there's the sort of conspicuous consumption, right, of the branding, and how that's framing the individual. But then wetsuit of many colors as a title not only brings in a sort of biblical reference, but brings in Dolly Parton as a cultural reference. And I think that that's um, that sort of three-legged structure of material shift and uh, context, and then something in the title that's sort of shifting us to a third other sort of space. Um, you'll see that's a pattern in a lot of the sort of, I guess, naming conventions of the work, I would say.
All right. Should we open it up for questions? Anyone has any? Feel welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question, or I can read it out from the chat.
Hi, Zach.
Mike?
How's it going? Do you want the fun question or the dumb question? Sorry. I'll ask the fun question. Can you talk a little bit more about like puns in your work and maybe how that relates to the disenfranchised, or not, like maybe the breakdown of meaning in culture, right? Or something like that. Like a pun being a kind of slippage of a signifier.
Yeah.
How puns function in your work, maybe to supplement the ideas in the work.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've I always say that wordplay is the sexiest form of foreplay. I I like a good pun, and I think that there's something, there's inherently something like, puns are, dad joke. That's, I think, is sort of contemporarily how people think about them. But I think there's also there's something like simply clever about that sort of slippage in language. And I think in a lot of ways, I employ material in that way, right? There's this, the Mosaic Tablet 2.0. There's a sort of slippage in the material where there just happens to also be a blue line in this. And through a really simple, it's like a comparison. It's a bad comparison, right? It's like, well, this thing kind of looks like this thing, so I'll make it one of these. There's something in poor taste about it, but I think in that simplicity, I think it works to sort of redirect a lens, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Simple but resonant. I like that. I was also, my other question, and then I'll shut up, is can you talk about time in relation to your work? I'm thinking about the collection, or the fact that, right, the child chair sat as an archway at grad school like years ago. Like that's almost a decade old and it's still kicking. And like, yeah, sorry, I don't want to direct the question, but talk about time in regards to your work.
Sure. I think time exists in a number of ways. I mean, anytime, you know, from the viewer standpoint, anytime you're dealing with the three-dimensional object being experienced in space, you're inherently experiencing time, right? What type of new information you're learning as you're moving around that thing in space. Um, but I also think that you know, working with found objects, a certain like sense of like history comes into play. Like rarely will you see uh, a work of mine that's like crisp and pristine and clean. I think sort of debris and dirt and corrosion and wear and like residue, the residual, you know, all of those things are you know, manufactured in a lot of instances. This high chair, Caleb, you switch to the other piece of or image of, yeah, next one up. Sorry. So like to put the, like I built a device that sprays dust, Fuller's Earth, to apply dust to this once it's, you know, in its place or whatever. So I think that there's time implied there. I think there's also a sort of, there's a periodness to some of the objects that I pick, regarding, again, there's sort of means of manufacturing, and even like shapes and colors and forms, right? This sort of Greco Fisher Pricey looking form, that's sort of iconic of a certain era. And then I guess, you know, from the back end of things, you know, you mentioned the extension of this chair. You know, I'm a collector at heart, a hoarder maybe. As a professional sculptor, I get to call my piles of junk material, which makes it sound more glamorous. But you know, there's a, you know, I spend a lot of time, maybe even you know, maybe 30%, 40% of my practice looking for stuff, you know, looking for material. And it takes a long time to get to know a thing, right? You found something and it seems to resonate with you. You want to have some type of intervention with it. But what is that? You've got to get to know like what it's capable of and how it speaks and its tone of voice and, you know, that research, that detective work. You know, so from a, you know, the back end of things, the studio practice side of things, some of these objects that, you know, I finally end up making a finished product with, I've been carrying around with me for, you know, 2 or 3 or 5 years and have made, you know, a half a dozen different projects with them. And, you know, it's like, no, that like, that's not exactly how it should be. Like I can push that a little further, or there's still some more meat on the bone there that I haven't gotten to, like this needs to happen, you know? So yeah, time exists in a number of ways. That's an interesting question.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Some of these things you were talking about time and about puns, calls back to a question in the chat from Sierra. Seeing the types of toys you work with and how you apply it to a child's imagination with play, is there a reason on why you focus only on the child's material? Have you ever thought of dabbling with adult toys, I suppose literally or figuratively? Do you think this would portray more on adult imagination? So could you talk a little bit about what an adult material is for you, and sort of, I don't know, like I said, that relates a bit to time of how we understand materials, how we learn about them, how we learn through play, and speak to that.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I've probably made something with an adult toy before. In that sort of in that sort of erotic sense, I suppose. I don't know. I think in all honesty, I think adults are really lazy, and I think it's really easy to your perceptions of things get over calcified, I think, and sort of fixed in a rigid way. As a study of like thinking about how human animals engage with stuff, right? Toys, tools, technologies. Um, you know, I think I guess maybe the child is like, that's the case study, right? That's what I think is interesting. There's also for in the logistics of things, like when you bring up we haven't talked about like the toy guns that I was making or anything that are in the show, but when you bring up kids in work dealing with like complicated issues, like people immediately have an opinion, right? There's something sort of divisive about that. And I think that means that there's something sort of inherently divisive about the toy. I think there has to be. Whether people are thinking about it that way or not, right? So yeah, I guess that's why the toy, right? Because they're inherently sort of difficult if you really critique them. For me as a kid growing up in the 90s, what were the toys? It was your stereotypic baby dolls and plastic pots and pans for the girls. And I got a monster truck that turned into a robot. It's like, okay, so, let's really, with a critical lens, look at what we think we're supposed to be teaching our children with these things. It's like, well, sure, imagination, yeah, that's great, but how are those things being a conduit for that? Again, it's immediately more divisive, I think. That's sort of the short answer to that.
Yeah.
Yes, I have to cut more. Yeah, you're gonna want to, because if you do it with, you understand, if you do it with the machine, you're gonna fast it up. Like you're gonna cut it like a gemstone.
Trying to find this person. All right, I'm muted though. Cooper has a question in the chat, piggybacking off of something that you already said. There are a lot of pretend guns, etc. Can you talk about that? I'll bring up your improvised fence.
Yeah. So, so this is the work that's in the show, the configuration of these objects that's in the show. Maybe, yeah, that was back in 2018, I think, the summer of 18. I started making these like representations of toy guns. Like, I'm hesitant to say that they looked like guns. I mean, that was the intention, but they were, broomsticks and hockey sticks and crutches and canes that I was adding handles and sight pins to. And yeah, this is great, Kaylee, this kind of thing. And, it's like, okay, I want to build these things. Well, I need material. In order to find material, I need some criteria for what could be a potential gun part. And, quickly I realized that a potential gun part is essentially anything that can be pointed. which is essentially anything that is like longer than it is wide, right? Anything that you can point in that way. And I think, you know, really quickly I realized that although I was making these toy guns and thinking about, you know, my experience growing up hunting and you know, playing war and what that means and everything that was going on in, you know, gun culture today, or the way that gun culture and, you know, popular culture were sort of blending into one thing, everything that's happened in the last year, you know, it became really clear that it's like, it's not the gun that I'm interested in, it's this idea of power and pointing and naming, right? Like I'm taking a certain amount of authority just by calling these things guns or calling them potential gun parts. Anyone else who, you know, does the same takes that on. I think, yeah, these are, so I started making these things and, you know, thinking about different ways to show them. If we could do the like teepee looking pyramid thing. Yeah, so I'm looking at ways historically that guns have existed in space during the Civil War, particularly because of the type of muskets that people were using. Getting stuff in your barrel was potentially really deadly. And so propping your guns up, you know, around the fire or whatever, sometimes even using this as your A-frame for cooking out of, you know, this is a popular method. So playing around with lots of different ways to show these things or how they can exist in space. And what I ended up, and I've shown the physical things, you know, on the wall and in a couple of different ways. I ended up producing photographs of them that were printed and framed at 1-to-1 scale. So they were life size. And I think up until this point, this was the most like dynamic and also sort of disturbing way of presenting these things. They, no matter who I was talking to, they were still calling them guns. And now they're not only not guns, they're assemblages of domestic objects that sort of take on the form of hypothetical guns. And these are photographs of them. Like, I'm immediately thinking about Kossuth 1 and 3 chairs. I'm thinking about Rene Magritte, the treachery of imagery, right? Like, this is not a pipe, this is not a gun. And we're still talking, they're still charged in this way, you know? And I don't, you know, I obviously I knew. So the first like broom gun that I made, I actually made in grad school back in 2013, 12 or 13. And I traded it. It was a standard sort of straw broom, like any one of these here. And I made a wooden handle for it and a stock that went in the front that sort of looked like a magazine clip for like a assault rifle or something. And it actually had a kitchen knife, like a paring knife attached to the end of it. Yeah, the gray one at the top here. So this is a replica of the first broom gun that I made. And that one I actually ended up trading to a colleague for an elk antler or something like that for another piece. So this is a replica of that. And once I started sort of seriously thinking, and at the time in 2014, like I was like, I do not want to touch gun rights and gun culture with a whatever foot pole, like in my work. Like it wasn't something I was interested in. And so it was really interesting to see that sort of circle back around and the way that I had been thinking about stuff. And it seemed applicable. It seemed like whether I wanted to or not, it was like time for me to pursue this work again. And, you know, what I think is really powerful about the work is that they're made out of things that you'd like find in your closet. And as I was, you know, honing my criteria for what a gun part could be, looking around, like existing in the world, it changed the way that I was looking at stuff. It changed the way that I was thinking about linear objects, which is always, for me, is the really fun part about working with found stuff, because it, you know, again, it changes your lens or whatever. So, yeah, so I've been producing these photographs of these, and I think the next image, there's one sort of hanging. Yeah, that looks great. So if we maybe want to go back to them in the show, actually. Yeah, that's great. So, you know, I was interested in putting these things in the space, but again, in a slightly more subversive way. And I think, so this is how, essentially, this is how my gun parts were stored in my studio as I was making these things. My studio sort of got converted. Yeah, we can show that one. Sort of got converted to a gun manufacturing center. And, you know, I started thinking about, well, if the artwork is gun, then I'm not gun dealer, I'm gun manufacturer, and what does that mean? And you know, all of that stuff. But so what I think is most interesting about this the way that they're propped up against the wall in this configuration in the show is that they sort of turn back into brooms and sticks and crutches and fishing poles, and it sort of looks like a pile of anything that you'd find in the corner of a garage or a shed, or, you know, maybe an attic, I suppose. And then upon further inspection, you start to see things that it starts to materialize in a way that you start to see handles and sight pins and bayonets and things. And that I think, again, goes back to this, like, how did these things get back into the real world? Obviously, you know, these forms that sort of resemble firearms, I think, are incredibly dangerous potentially right now. You know, people are being killed for a lot less. So I don't envision these things being something that I'll be able to let really out into the world in the way that I'm thinking about a cluster of baseballs sewn together, or rubber gloves with fringe on them, you know. And in a way, this is probably the first thing that I've ever made that these types of things that sort of need to be destroyed, right? I don't know. Like, I would think hard about who I would sell one of these to, because if it, you know, if they ever decided that they didn't want it and just throw it away or something, I would be concerned about the implications.
So that relates to a question that Joey threw in the chat. Does that make the gallery the gun dealer? Aaron says, yup.
Yeah,
So would you
potentially.
sell these, right? That's the question.
What was that?
You said you wouldn't sell these. I think that's the question.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, whether I like it or not, I'm in the business of making and selling objects. These just happen to operate in a really in a way that I haven't really encountered before. It's not to say that they're not for sale, but, you know, do I need, like, what's the different than like your normal sale of artwork with a condition report and insurance and that, like, do I need
Like a
Do these-
byline of sorts.
Right. Do these need serial numbers? Do I need a way to track them? I don't know. Is that, you know, getting out of the spirit of the improvised object, you know, because that's still, I think, one of the things that I think is really powerful about the altering of found objects, and I think it exists in culture all over the place. The custom car, the altered clothing, you change your house, you like we make alterations to the material goods that are sort of supplied to us, and I think that that desire to modify or customize or augment or alter, I think that comes from a desire to take a little bit of that authority back, like living with these mass-produced things. I think it's a tiny little rage against the homogeny of the things that we're forced to define ourselves with or encouraged to buy into and define ourselves with. So, you know, in a way, trying to track these things goes against that, right? Creating a database or an archive with them in that way doesn't seem right. But, you know, this is a perfect example of work that, you know, the viewer and posterity at the end of the day, culture as a whole, have the power to change the way that a work functions. And now I've got some things that I've got to seriously think about. Right?
Sure. So I want to be considerate of everyone's time here, and thank you all for tuning in and listening with us. Violet had a question in the chat earlier that leans into some of what you're talking about these accidental guns, or like making meaning by accident, or maybe not by accident, but by surprise. She says, I'm thinking about the fake guns and the foam propelled rocket. How often do happy accidents play into your work? So if we want to talk about that quickly.
Yeah, that's an awesome question, Violet. Thank you. I think that I think about it like incidental learning, right? That's an educational term. I think that aspect is really important. I don't even think of them as happy accidents anymore. I think of it as that I'm working really hard to set up a series of conditions with which I can play in that are going to optimize these types of outcomes. And that's through a lot of trial and error, you know. To say that, you know, when I discarded that can of grape foam that ended up creating the trail for this, you know, this rocket trail, was that done intentionally? No. However, I've worked really hard to set up conditions in my studio with which that can be looked at as a building block, as potential material, as something that should be considered. Should be considered. Yeah, that's it. And there's a lot of trial and error that happens. And a lot of like, set this here and look at it, and set this over here and look at it, and turn that upside down and look at it, and like take a photograph of that and Photoshop it this way and take a look at it. Like there's an incredible amount of time that's spent. And that's what, when I talk about like getting to know a thing or getting to understand what it's capable of or what its reserve is, that's how you put in that work. Great question. Thank you.
Yeah,
that was awesome.
Yeah, so great. It is such a great show. I hope that everyone here gets a chance to see it in the gallery, because even though these pictures are terrific and the talk was great, the show is just like, I go to, you see shows and you see the work itself that you really love, but this show is really good. And so you should come see it. And just thank you so much, Zach, for all of the work that you did, getting the show together and installing it. Like, Zach did everything for this show. So we really appreciate that. But it just has, I don't know, like the work all speaks to each other so well in the show. So we really love it.
Thank you, Amy.
Yeah,